and fact checks from the perspective of The Global Brief with Bianca Nobilo. Tonight on CNN.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Live from CNN Abu Dhabi, this is Connect the World.
I'm Eleni Jakos in Abu Dhabi. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Finland and Sweden will both hand in their formal applications to NATO on Wednesday, Sweden's Prime Minister just announced. The leaders of both nations have been meeting in Stockholm today. If the applications are accepted, it'll be a seismic shift for European security, and we'll bring you more on those diplomatic lines later in the show. But for now, a major story from on the ground in Ukraine. Ukraine's defense of Mariupol is effectively over, with the evacuation of more than 260 people from the Azovstal steel plant. And this is how it looked after they left. Ukraine's deputy defense minister says dozens of injured Ukrainian troops were transported to a medical facility. The others on their way to a city in Russian-controlled territory. She says a prisoner exchange with Russia is expected soon. Melissa Bell is tracking developments for us in Kyiv. Melissa, we've been watching very closely the developments at the Azovstal steel plant, and it's literally been one of those huge crises points for the Ukrainians. Give me a sense of how they were able to negotiate, soldiers leaving, and importantly, where to from here.
Well, the negotiations continue. Really, all we've seen confirmation of so far, Eleni, is the evacuation of some of those fighters that had been in the Azovstal steel plants then for so many weeks, and that the whole world and Ukraine certainly had been extremely focused on, given the worsening humanitarian circumstances in which they were living and holding out inside that plant, since it was the last bastion of Ukrainian resistance in and around Mariupol. So it's extremely significant militarily. The fact that these more than 260 fighters have now surrendered to Russia, extremely significant to Moscow and a victory for them. It is their fate now that hangs in the balance of these extremely delicate and sensitive and ongoing negotiations. The idea, what Ukraine is hoping, is that they will be handed back as some sort of prisoner exchange, but the negotiations are underway and have not yet resulted in an actual agreement for a prisoner exchange. But you're quite right to point it out. These men and women had become such a strong symbol of Ukrainian resistance, something that the whole country was watching very carefully, very closely. Now, these last few days, we've had the opportunity to head up to the north of the country, in those parts around Chernihiv, in Chernihiv region, that had been occupied by Russian forces for part of the war for several weeks, and from where some more stories of resistance and extraordinary tales of survival have been emerging. This is where Mykola Kulichenko was buried alive. The blindfolds, he says, he and his two brothers were made to wear by Russian soldiers, still strewn by their shallow grave. Mykola shows us where the bullet entered his cheek. His brothers, Yevyen and Dmytro, were killed, but he managed to escape their tomb. I had to live to tell this story, not to Ukrainians, but to the world, he says. The regional prosecutor's office says a war crimes investigation's been opened. This is Mykola's house, where he lived with his two brothers and along with their sister. On March 18th, he says, Russian soldiers came into the village looking for men that they believed were responsible for an attack on one of their convoys. And that is when the family's nightmare began. 3 soldiers entered the house looking for anything that might link the brothers to the attack on the convoy. They found nothing, but what they did find was something to link the family to the military in the shape of their grandfather's military medal. They also found Yevyen's military bag, since as a reservist in the Ukrainian army, he was preparing to go and fight. For 4 days, their sister Irina heard nothing from her brothers, until Mykola came back from the dead. I came home and there was Mykola. I looked at his eyes and asked, where are the others? He said, There are no others. Mykola says that after being taken from their home, the three brothers were blindfolded and interrogated in a cellar for 4 days. They were then beaten and taken to the site of their execution. 2 months on, he still struggles to speak. What do I think of the Russians? I hate them with all my soul. They are animals. They should burn in hell. It was only after the Russian withdrawal that a month after their execution, Yevgeny and Dmitrio were given a proper burial, a tombstone, and the peace that Mykola's been denied. Now, those alleged war crimes now the subject of an investigation. Of course, just some of the many more than 11,000 war crimes recorded since the war began here in Ukraine. Many of them already the subject of an investigation, like the ones surrounding the Kulichenko family and what happened to them in those tragic circumstances. But I think it's important to remember that even as those investigations get underway, the war continues. And just south of there, in fact, between where I'm standing now and that village on the outskirts of Chernihiv, lies the military complex of Desna, where overnight more strikes hit. Many people were killed, many others wounded, we understand. We don't have the exact figures for the time being. And this in the context of a war over which negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are, for the time being, Eleni, entirely suspended.
Yeah. Melissa, thank you so very much. What an incredible story. Right, while Ukraine's battle for Mariupol appears lost, around Kharkiv in the northeast, the Ukrainian military says forces are advancing on Russian positions, including a border town that Russia has been using to resupply its troops. These images show damage to Russian vehicles. To the south, heavy fighting is reported along the front lines in the Donbas region. Ukraine's government released this video of damaged residential areas in Donetsk. It says its forces are repelling Russian advances. I want to bring in CNN military analyst General Wesley Clark. He served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. General, thank you so very much for joining us. I want to get a macro picture from you, but we've been discussing Mariupol, you and I, for so many weeks now, and it seems that the battle for Mariupol is effectively over. And the Ukrainians really enduring so many sacrifices there. What do you make of the latest developments?
Well, I think that the defenders have done an incredible job of holding out under the most extraordinary circumstances and difficult circumstances. They've been incredibly courageous. The Russian attack was stalled there. It distracted the Russian advance. It held the Russians back. It kept Russian forces focused on Mariupol rather than exploiting to the north or to the west. So the defense was militarily successful. It was a humanitarian tragedy in the area. And I think that President Zelensky has made the right decision, ending the mission at this point and saving the lives of these brave defenders.
Do you think that Putin is going to announce victory there?
Well, I think that there wasn't a possibility of more success had they held on. So I think you have to consider that the defense in Mariupol was a relative success. You know, at the start of the war, it seemed that Russia had the possibility of sweeping throughout Ukraine. Well, Mariupol was a hard point, and they weren't able to continue the momentum of their advance, in part, large part in the south, because of Mariupol. And the continued dogged resistance of those defenders makes it a successful defense that may have proved a crucial turning point in the strategy of the whole war.
Yeah, they were hoping, General, for a blitzkrieg type of, sweep through Ukraine. That's what they miscalculated. And you rightly mentioned, the beginning of the war, we saw Russians sort of sprinkled around Ukraine. They had to regroup. Let's take a look at the map here. And it's pretty indicative of how the Russians had to sort of rethink their objectives. When we're so far into the war right now, General, do you get a sense that Russia is not achieving its military objectives, that it needs to rethink its strategy? And we thought that the East was going to be the big focal point, but they're also losing ground there.
Well, it's clear that Russia hasn't achieved its strategy. But I think we have to be clear that in the West, we have to think our strategy through. You know, I hear many voices in the West saying, oh, just stop the killing, just get it stopped right now. Yes, that's a humanitarian outcry that's very understandable. But this is a struggle not just about Ukraine, but about the future of the international system. It's very important that when the fighting ends, Russia be out of Ukraine and Ukraine's territorial integrity and political independence be assured, just as the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 promised. Aggression can't be rewarded. So yes, the Russians are trying to rethink their strategy. We have to be sure about our strategy and what our objectives are in assisting Ukraine.
Look, the Russians have a choice to further mobilize or de-escalate. We know that de-escalation would be admitting defeat. How do you think Putin is going to be looking at the latest strategies, and also keeping in mind Finland and Sweden have formally applied to join NATO?
Well, I think Putin is still rational, despite the fact that he must be irate, feeling besieged and angry that it hasn't worked out the way he planned. But a decision to escalate by Russia has to be measured against what the results would be. And the simple truth is that Russian escalation would bring a more rapid defeat for Russia. And as long as we continue to show this to Putin, he's not likely to escalate. In fact, this is what we need to do to end this fighting. We have to convince Mr. Putin that he cannot win and that escalation will cause him to lose more rapidly.
General Clark, thank you so very much. Always good speaking with you. Much appreciated for your insight.
Thank you.
And as fighting in the south of Ukraine continues, we have been getting more reports of Russian attacks near the strategic city of Odessa. A tourist center was hit by missiles on Monday. Though the port city has not come under full assault, Odessa is home to many Russian-speaking people who could potentially be allies with Moscow, but some are angry about the brutality Russia has shown in this fight. CNN's Sarah Seidner has that story.
The remains of freshly bombed buildings, a hotel and homes reduced to dust, the result of the latest Russian missile attack in the Odessa region that has experienced strike after strike on places people live, work, and visit. This is Russia's attempt to terrorize a target it desperately wants to possess.
Tell me what the strategic importance is of Odessa.
This is the seagate of our country, he says. This is a city of legend. It's home to Ukraine's largest Black Sea port, used both commercially and militarily. Russia has already attacked its oil refinery. If Putin's forces were to take the Odessa region, Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast would be controlled by Russia. The mayor of Odessa bristles at the idea. Ukraine today is a maritime power. It will be a completely different state without access to the sea, without transport logistics, he says. We and our armed forces will do everything to prevent the enemy from entering. But the ties to the enemy run deep, historically and financially. Before the war, Russian tourists helped this Ukrainian seaside city thrive. Ideal. Russians really liked our cuisine, our shops here, the sea, architecture, and there were no problems. Alexander Babich is a historian who also owns a tour guide company. He says citizens of Odessa speak Russian more than they speak Ukrainian. Pro-Russian politicians were voted into office regularly. The mayor was once friendly with Russia. He himself spoke to us in Russian.
Were you pro-Russian before and changed?
I want to say that I have always had pro-Odessa views, he says, but I love and respect the history of my city where I was born. Everywhere you look in this city is a reminder of its Russian history. There are statues of Alexander Pushkin, considered Russia's greatest poet, and monuments to the conqueror of this land, Russian Empress Catherine the Great. Her sculpture used to be guarded and kept pristine. Now, it's soiled and a fresh Ukrainian flag flies on it. There has been a long fight over whether to remove these symbols of imperialism in Odessa.
Я думаю, сейчас формируется социальный
There is
запрос,
social demand saying we need to get rid of these symbols, he says. Not everyone agrees. Odessa writer and poet Paul Makarov says the monuments should stand.
Отношение было, естественно, позитивное, то есть мы ценим.
The attitude was positive. We appreciate and respect Catherine. Today's events should in no way affect our attitude towards her. And there is this problem. If we remove the monument to Catherine, we need to rename the square, he says. It was for a time named after Karl Marx, for a while named after Hitler, then again Karl Marx, and here again after Catherine. What name should we choose? But the more Russian missiles wipe away lives here, the more fierce the argument to erase the physical reminders of its Russian past. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Odessa.
All right, well, coming up, we return to our top story. Finland and Sweden push ahead with their efforts to join NATO, but not all of the bloc's members seem pleased that they're joining. And we'll take you back to Beirut to see why Hezbollah suffered a setback in Lebanon's first vote since the 2019 uprising.
Inside Africa, in association with Zenith Bank.
In December 2021, the Wine Ark opened its doors as a brand home for Black-owned wine businesses.
So I came to visit this facility in 2015 and I saw the potential. So when you stand on this deck of ours and you overlook Stellenbosch, it says the authentic story of Stellenbosch, our authentic diversified cultures all coming together and being part of this unique industry.
For Stellenbosch winemaker Carmen Stevens, the launch of the Wine Ark is a welcome initiative.
It's the first home or brand home for Black-owned brands in South Africa. It's giving us that space where people can come sit down and enjoy our wines. It is such a fantastic initiative, and it shows our heritage. It shows where we as Black-owned brands are coming from.
The globetrotting and adventures, and we're longing to get out and go.
This is living.
Uncovering the city's DNA, meeting people who will share its secrets.
I love being here.
And making discoveries that wow.
You've got to be joking. Nice here, isn't it?
It's a world of wonder. Now, go and see it. Saturday on CNN, in association with Turkish Airlines.
Welcome back. In Lebanon's first election since the country's economic meltdown, some voters went looking for change, and that means the pro-Hezbollah bloc, backed by Iran, has lost its majority in Lebanon's parliament. It may sound like a big shift, but the question is, how significant is it really? CNN's Ben Wiedemann has been covering Lebanon for decades, and he joins us now live from the capital, Beirut. Ben, always good to see you. We have a bit of time to get through some of the key issues, and I think that when we say Hezbollah coalition has lost some of its seats or the majority in parliament, one wonders, you know, who are these other candidates, these independent candidates that are now gaining traction? What do we know about their ideologies?
Well, there's at this point around 12 or almost 10% of the parliament or the new parliament are people called reformists or independents. These are people, some of whom were actually participants in the October 2019 uprising that filled this spot right here, which is just next to the government headquarters, the Prime Minister's office, back in October 2019. Some are affiliated with the reform movement. So certainly this is significant, keeping in mind that in the last parliamentary elections in 2018, there was only one person who was identified as independent who got a seat in parliament. So it does appear that this is significant. However, of course, they're only 10% perhaps of parliament. So it's going to be a bit of a stretch for them to actually be able to push through legislation, but it's certainly okay. What you're hearing is gunfire from an adjacent neighborhood where there are many supporters of Nabih Berri, who's the Speaker of Parliament. He's apparently speaking at the moment on television. He is a close ally of Hezbollah, so you might be hearing a bit of that gunfire as I speak. So anyway, to get back to what I was saying, yes, it's significant, and it definitely sends a message to the other members of parliament that they need to start listening to the ordinary concerns of people who don't identify themselves by their sect, but rather as Lebanese who want to see this country fixed, the economy brought back to life. Eleni?
So Ben, you and I, we've spoken about this numerous times. We've seen stalemates in the past where there's a failure to form a government, and that has played a very strong role in the economic demise of Lebanon, which is absolutely tragic to watch when you see what inflation is doing to people there. Are you concerned that we might be seeing a stalemate scenario playing out once again?
No, when you consider that the last parliamentary elections took place in May of 2018, in the subsequent 4 years, about half of those, just slightly less, were spent waiting for politicians to agree on the next government. So that's the real danger. And what we've seen already is the limping, the Lebanese lira that has lost so much of its value against the dollar has lost more value in the last 24 hours because people realize it will take a long time for these politicians to form a new government. And the longer that there's no government, the longer it will be that Lebanon's pressing economic problems will not be addressed. Certainly what we're seeing is with perhaps the weakening of Hezbollah, with more reformers in government, there is a chance that there will be progress made, that the politicians will finally focus on this country's problems. But it may take a while, and this really just underscores yet again where the anger of so many Lebanese at the political elite comes from. The political elite is fine. They're not suffering. Most of them have their money abroad, and they continue to live the high life, while most people here are seeing their standard of living plummet. Eleni?
Yeah, and Ben, we've even seen from, international institutions saying, well, there has to be reform. There has to be a change in the elite's thinking and the way that Lebanon is governed. Do you get a sense from having covered Lebanon in such a long, over such a long period of time, that this could be the start of change?
I think, going into the elections, there was a lot of skepticism that nothing would change, that the politics would continue to have no relation to reality here. But after it, I think people are taking hope that perhaps the message is getting across that, you shouldn't protect your sect, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Druze, or whatever, that you should be looking out for the welfare of ordinary people. You as a member of parliament, you as a politician, as a president, as a prime minister, as a minister in government. Certainly the message that's coming out is that despite the divisions within the so-called reformist camp, the fact that there were multiple lists in almost every electoral district, that if the reform candidates had joined in one list, that they would have done much better. But the fact that, despite that they did so well indicates there's a huge appetite for change. It's just that there's still a long way to go before change, real change, can actually happen. Eleni?
Yeah, you'd think that the welfare of the average people would be priority for those governing. But Ben, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be speaking on this a lot more. Much appreciated. Right, we're seeing new tensions elsewhere in the region after mourners at a funeral procession in Jerusalem clashed with Israeli police. The Palestinian Red Crescent says more than 70 Palestinians were injured. Israeli police say 6 officers were also hurt. The funeral was for a man who died following last month's unrest at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. We have Atika Schubert covering this recent wave of violence, and she joins us now from Jerusalem. Atika, from what we understand, and also the CNN producers on the ground, do we know why Israeli forces were using force or violence against the Palestinian mourners, and what exactly prompted this escalation?
Well, I think you have to understand first that Israeli security forces and police in particular have been on very increased alert recently. Tensions have really increased across Israel and the West Bank because of a spate of attacks on Israeli citizens by Palestinians. A number of Israelis have been killed, and as a result, you've seen Israeli security forces in general have this heightened state of alert. However, it is the second time in a week that we've seen Israeli police use force at Palestinian funerals in Jerusalem. Yesterday's funeral was for Walid al-Sharif. He's a young Palestinian man who was actually injured last month during unrest, also involving Israeli police at Al-Aqsa's Mosque compound in the old city of Jerusalem. This happened last month, but he succumbed to his injuries just this week, and so the funeral was yesterday. Israeli police blocked people from attending his funeral at the mosque, and as a result, that's what triggered the clashes that lasted for at least an hour. Palestinians threw bottles, rocks, and fireworks. Israeli police used tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber bullets. At least one person was very seriously injured when he was shot in the eye with a rubber-coated bullet. Unfortunately, this is just the latest in this cycle of violence that is continuing. As I mentioned, there was the spate of violent and deadly attacks, and as a result, Israeli security forces have blocked off access to the Palestinian territories and conducted a number of raids in the West Bank, some of which have turned deadly. And in fact, the Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh was covering one of those Israeli police raids in the town of Jenin when she was shot and killed. So it does not, these tensions continue to rise, and there doesn't seem to be any way at this point to calm them down.
Atika Schubert, thank you so very much. Let's get you up to speed now on some other stories that are on our radar. The skies over Iraq glowing red after another sandstorm hit the country. Health officials tell CNN at least 4,000 people have suffered breathing issues. Flights out of Baghdad International Airport have resumed after being halted on Monday. This is the latest in a series of storms to strike Iraq in recent weeks. Cuba says it welcomes the easing of some U.S. restrictions. The Biden White House is reversing some Trump-era policies, making it easier for families to visit relatives on the communist-run island. But Cuba will remain on the U.S. State Department list of countries that support terrorism. North Korea has released the first specific figures on its COVID outbreak since acknowledging the country's first case last week. Health officials told state TV there have been around 168 confirmed COVID-19 infections. State media, however, have reported 1.4 million cases of, quote, fevers and 56 deaths. Ahead, we take you inside Afghanistan, where there is no food, no jobs, and fewer human rights. Christiane Amanpour will join us live from Kabul with a look at how the country is doing 9 months after the Taliban takeover. Plus, our top story tonight, Finland and Sweden are about to formally apply to NATO, but not all NATO members are sure they want them to join. We will take you to Sweden and Turkey just ahead.
$300 million years ago, there was no Africa, Asia, Americas, or Europe. Just one big supercontinent, Pangaea. And today, there is still a force connecting those divided by distance, reversing millions of years of rifting, making far feel close, bringing there to here. Turkish Airlines.
I am Nigerian by blood, British by birth, and American by residence. It is important to me that those same strands of inclusivity that flow through me are mirrored in the stories that we tell. One World is a place where Africa has an equal seat at the global table alongside Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Every continent has a voice, and where everyone watching has a stake in the global conversation.
One World with Zain Asher, tonight on CNN.
When you follow a story, you may be asked to take risks. And sometimes go down a path that's not marked.
Where Iraqi troops would pre-position and these Americans would advise them.
These protests are a test for Hamas.
Any understanding between Israel and Gaza could quickly fall apart again.
The protesters are just outside a military base. They're throwing rocks and security forces firing tear gas.
When you dare to take risks, you witness passion and persistence.
And they just want to get their past be processed so they can get out of this facility.
And that's where change happens.
The one thing they have in common is a determination to keep going.
I'm Matt Rivers in Moshun, Ukraine. This is CNN.
Finland and Sweden will hand in their formal applications to join NATO on Wednesday. Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson made the announcement just a short time ago. Speaking alongside her, Finland's president praised the move as a triumph for democracy. But their membership to NATO isn't a done deal. Turkey's president is voicing his opposition. He's accusing both nations of harboring terrorists and told them not to bother sending delegations to Turkey to try and change his mind.
Swedish and Finnish delegations are coming to Turkey on Monday. Are they coming to convince us? Excuse me, but they should not tire themselves. First of all, we should not say yes to those who impose sanctions on Turkey to join NATO, because then NATO would cease to be a security organization and become a place where representatives of terrorist organizations are concentrated.
With Turkey as NATO's second largest military power, it could be a significant roadblock. And we have reporters following both sides of the story. CNN's Nina Dos Santos joins us now from Stockholm, Sweden, and Jemana Karache is in Istanbul. Nina, I'd like to start off with you. I mean, you're seeing a show of force, Sweden and Finland making this decision together, announcing together. Give me a sense of what more needs to be done, because you and I have spoken about this. This is a process and it's going to take some time.
Yeah, and there's a recognition here in Sweden and also in Helsinki that it could take up to a year. And during that time, these countries need to show that they can continue to jointly negotiate their accession and that they won't be torn apart by any of these kind of wedge issues that are being thrown in their way, not least by, of course, Turkey, that has raised objections, as you just heard there, to Sweden offering asylum to Kurds, people who President Erdogan says are affiliated with the PKK and YPG. These are groups that he deems as terrorist organizations. And that criticism is largely leveled, for the large part, at Sweden rather than Finland. What we saw in this press conference was a joint show of force, as you said, à deux, which hopefully will then eventually lead to protection with 32 members if these two are eventually admitted into this elite and most powerful military alliance. And what we're seeing to try and push the diplomatic levers, especially with regard to Turkish opposition here, is the United States getting involved, with the US President Joe Biden having invited both of these two leaders now to Washington, D.C. to discuss their NATO membership bids. That meeting will take place on Thursday. We heard from the Swedish Prime Minister and also the Finnish President, whose parliament overwhelmingly voted in support of NATO just a few hours ago, that both of them would submit those bids tomorrow morning to NATO HQ by way of their ambassadors. But we also heard that they were looking forward to more of a relationship with Turkey. So that's quite interesting there. It gave an idea that there might be a bit of a diplomatic window, that Sweden might be willing to negotiate on some things. We're just not quite clear at this stage what. Eleni?
Nina Dos Santos, thank you so very much. We have Jumana Karacha standing by for us as well. Jumana, as we've just heard from Nina, the Turkish opposition right now is an interesting one. I want you to give me a sense of what Erdogan is demanding and whether he's been very clear about whether Turkey is going to block a vote on Sweden and Finland joining.
Look, I mean, Eleni, over the past few days, we've heard from Turkish officials and perhaps less diplomatically from President Erdogan what their issues are. And this centers around what Nina was mentioning there, the perceived support for Kurdish separatist groups, namely the PKK, which is deemed a terrorist organization, not just by Turkey, but by the EU and the United States. President Erdogan and Turkish officials saying that they have found a safe haven in countries like Sweden and Finland. Another issue, interestingly, as Nina was pointing out there, that perhaps there is room for negotiations and some sort of a compromise. And the feeling is perhaps it's the second issue that President Erdogan highlighted yesterday, and that's the arms embargo sanctions that were imposed in Turkey back in 2019 by these Nordic countries following Turkey's military offensive in northeastern Syria. President Erdogan saying yesterday he can't vote yes when those countries that are sanctioning his country to be members of the alliance. So perhaps there is room for negotiations there. And despite the tough talk from President Erdogan, Eleni, we've heard from his senior officials over the weekend saying that this is not Turkey's position. It's not a firm no, it is not a definite veto, but they want their security issues addressed. And we've also heard the support they've gotten from the NATO Secretary General saying, look, if Turkey has issues, they should be addressed. The consensus is that Turkey will eventually vote yes, as it has in the past.
Jumana, I have to ask you quickly. Turkey has about 401,000 active personnel right now. Just how important is Turkey to the NATO alliance?
Well, it is NATO's second largest army. This is historically a strategic ally that, has proven itself over the past decades, especially during the Cold War. Turkey continues to provide protection for NATO's southern flank. But, Turkey has had quite a complicated relationship with NATO, especially, Eleni, in recent years, where Turkey has felt that NATO allies have not really taken its security concerns, threats to its national security seriously, especially when it comes to NATO allies like the United States and others providing support to the YPG, that Syrian Kurdish militia in northeastern Syria, that Turkey views as an extension of the PKK, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, existential threat to this country. So look, while some feel that this is not necessarily just about Sweden and Finland right now, these are long-term grievances that Turkey has had with its NATO allies that are coming to the fore right now.
Jumana Karacha and Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much. Right, as Jumana just mentioned, Turkey is NATO's second largest military and extremely important to the strategic alliance. For more on this, I'd like to bring in Omer Taspina, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in Turkey. Omer, thank you so much for joining us. I think I have to ask you simply, do you think Turkey is capable of blocking a vote to get Sweden and Finland into NATO?
The short answer is yes. Turkey has leverage. NATO takes this decision, the decisions to take new partners unanimously. So if one country within NATO objects to membership of a new country, that country could block the whole process. Similar dynamics apply to the European Union. So Erdogan here has major leverage, not just with Finland and Sweden, but more importantly with the United States. And let's not forget, Erdogan is the ultimate transactional politician. So he's eyeing Washington and what he can get from President Biden more so than what he can get from just Sweden and Finland.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. So let's talk about those potential transactions. What will he be asking for? We know the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK, he's saying that Sweden has been assisting them or, harboring them. And then the other important point, which Turkey has been very vocal about, is the arms embargo, that it feels that it hasn't been able to purchase arms like other NATO members. How quickly do you think these issues can be and will be resolved?
Well, it depends on how much President Biden wants to compromise on Turkey. Right now, there are military sanctions against Turkey. In fact, Turkey is unable to buy the F-35s that it was part of the production process because it has purchased Russian missile defense system from Russia. So I'm sure what Erdogan wants is a presidential call from Biden or maybe an invitation to Washington where he can discuss with President Biden whether Turkey will receive F-35s, whether Turkey will receive military support from the United States, and whether this military embargo, the sanctions that Turkey is under from the United States, can be lifted. That's the big item on Erdogan's agenda.
Okay, so Omer, I have to ask you this. How do you think Turkey is weighing up the risks, the Russian risks and security in Europe versus his internal, issues and domestic issues, versus the fact that Putin must be smiling right now, going, Erdogan is exactly the challenge that, NATO needs right now to not expand. And Turkey's sitting in a very interesting position right now where they're saying, well, we're negotiating with Russia, we're playing this diplomat in the region. And on the other end, instead of showing, a force with NATO, perhaps standing on the sidelines.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, Putin has invested a lot on Erdogan in his relationship with Erdogan because he considered Turkey and Erdogan the weakest link within NATO. So Turkey purchasing Russian missile defense systems was very, very favorable to Russia. And right now, it seems like Putin has outsourced the issue of blocking NATO expansion to Turkey. And Turkey is willing to play that game. Now, that's why it depends on how much President Biden is willing to also compromise on this. This is just the opening gambit, in my opinion, of what Erdogan wants to do. He is very clear about being a transactional politician. He's also eyeing, Putin has a lot of leverage with Turkey. Turkey is dependent on Russian gas, Russian oil, Russian tourism, and Putin still has a military in Syria. If it bombs northern Syria, Turkey will have to open the border to another 1, 2, 3, 4 million Syrian refugees. So let's not forget that Putin is also part of this multidimensional chess, and he may force Erdogan not to compromise on this issue.
Yeah, very interesting, questioning the relationship between Erdogan and Putin, a conversation we must have again. Omer, thank you very much for your insights. Right, next we are joined by Christiane Amanpour live from Afghanistan. The humanitarian situation under the Taliban is going from bad to worse. By some calculations, it could be deadlier than decades of war.
In our world, every day is a beautiful one. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
More mortar strikes very, very close. They want us to start moving.
There's a sense the Russians haven't yet brought their full destructive power to bear.
Vladimir and his men have been alert since 4 a.m., fearing a Russian attack.
They were living here in frigid temperatures.
Sounds to me like many of these war crimes will go unpunished.
In Helsinki,
Kyiv,
Kramatorsk.
This is CNN.
Transformation, technology, new Marketplace Europe.
Brand designs and brand price tags to match. We're exploring the luxurious world of watches.
Marketplace Europe, Sunday on CNN.
As rights dwindle in Afghanistan, people there have one less option for seeking justice. The Taliban dissolved the country's independent Human Rights Commission, along with several other agencies. And they cite budgetary reasons. Afghanistan's economy is so battered, nearly 20 million people are said to be facing acute hunger. There are fears the crisis could kill more Afghans than 2 decades of war. All this as the Taliban say they want to be considered a legitimate government. CNN chief international anchor Christiana Mampour is reporting for us from Kabul. Christiane, it's one thing for us to read the data and the stats from where we are, comfort of our own homes. It's another to see it. Can you give me a sense of what you've experienced?
Yes, Eleni, and as you know, and as the world knows, Afghanistan has really fallen off the map because of the attention paid to Russia's war on Ukraine. And by the way, the wheat shortages, the grain shortages there are further impacting the desperate and grinding poverty here and other places around the world. All that to say that the statistics are truly horrendous, and the UN, various different organizations basically are saying that, you know, potentially up to 9 million people could face famine-like conditions. There are some 20 million people, that's almost half the population, facing and in the midst of acute hunger. The IRC, the International Rescue Committee, says that nearly half the population here survives on less than 1 meal a day. These sound like statistics, but we have seen it, and we have talked to people who are undergoing these terrible conditions. And as you said, the extraordinary fact is that according to the humanitarian organizations, the number of people who could die because of this terrible humanitarian catastrophe could dwarf the number of civilians who've died during 20 years of war. Those were the very, very worst predictions. Now, they have managed to get through the winter, but aid agencies are concerned that it will just crop up again, this terrible shortage, particularly because a drought that is already building might get worse. And as I said, grain and other food prices have skyrocketed across the world. This country is not immune. And we saw people who, I mean, honestly, in Kabul, we were told that some of these people had never in their lives and never in history stood in line for humanitarian assistance. Some of the people we saw, we were told and we asked, you know, had jobs before. They were educated, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees. There were women, there were men, they were old, they were young. There is no discrimination in terms of the poverty as it is striking the people here right now. So we've been to hospitals, to aid distribution centers, into, you know, into one family's home. As I said, some eat just 1 meal a day, and that is, even that is a hard scrabble. Some have to put their children out to work to try to get some income. When I say children, I mean 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. It's truly a terrible situation on this humanitarian level, Eleni.
Yeah, it's completely shocking to hear, Christiane. I mean, look, the World Food Programme from the start of this crisis was pleading for more funds to assist. Give me a sense of just how, you know, present the humanitarian agencies are on the ground and whether they have enough resources to be able to assist. You've rightly said there's been a huge supply constraint on grain and wheat, which of course is compounding the issue.
Well, exactly. Now, the humanitarian agencies, they're working, really hard. There are sanctions on this country, as you know, but the United States and other countries, but mostly the United States, has done these, what they call carve-outs, quite a few carve-outs to make sure that all the aid the humanitarian agencies need does go to the people. They will not funnel any money through the Taliban government. It's all going around the Taliban and to the people. They've also, they tell me, a Western official, that they have had carve-outs for businesses, including some businesses that, are conducted through the government. So they're trying to do their best to assuage the humanitarian crisis. But humanitarian assistance is not a replacement or you can't have an economy just based on humanitarian assistance. So the economy, the activity here has collapsed over the last 9 months since the Taliban's been in power and since the West left this country to its own devices. It's truly a real moral dilemma, because now, according to Western officials who I speak to, they've got to decide whether they're going to engage with the Taliban and to try to save lives, or whether they're going to continue to hold this government accountable for just about everything, including, of course, women's rights. And we do delve into that more this evening on our show, and we will continue to do so this week, because it is part of the terrible crisis that has emerged here, because the West doesn't want to engage in part with a government that does not uphold the rights of the women as they have won them over the last 20 years, and that does not abide by international humanitarian and human rights protocols. So this is a very, very difficult dilemma, and the cost of it and the price of it is being paid by the people here. It's truly tragic. I haven't seen it this bad since I first covered Afghanistan in the 90s, and humanitarian organizations say it's much worse today.
Christian, thank you so much for bringing to light these issues. And I know you sat down with an exclusive interview with the deputy Taliban leader, and we'll be watching that full interview during your show, Amanpour, later tonight, 9 p.m. here in Abu Dhabi, and that's 9:30 in Kabul. And of course, you can also find out more on CNN.com. That was Christian Amanpour reporting live from Kabul. It has been a solemn week here in the UAE, where leaders are making condolence calls for the late president, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and they've been meeting with his successor, Sheikh Mohammed. The visitors could give us an idea of the UAE's direction and the relationships it's forging in the region moving forward. On Monday, we saw US Vice President Kamala Harris lead a major delegation to Abu Dhabi, trying to smooth out some recent bumps in the relationship, especially over Washington's refusal so far to relist Yemen's Houthi movement as a terrorist organization. That same day, Sheikh Mohammed welcoming Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, as well as the Foreign Minister of Iran. He is the highest-ranking Iranian official to visit the UAE in months, as the two countries signal their desire to de-escalate tensions that have marred their relationship. Up next, after several cancelled appearances, Queen Elizabeth is on the move. So to what do we owe this surprise? That's coming up next.
The ever-changing weather around the world. Ever-diverse terrain and roads across the world. With Kumho Tire that has conquered all. There is no road you cannot go. Go with Kumho. Kumho Tire.
300 million years ago, there was no Africa, Asia, Americas, or Europe. Just one big supercontinent, Pangaea. And today, there is still a force connecting those divided by distance, reversing millions of years of rifting, making far feel close, bringing there to here. Turkish Airlines.
So many questions about what is the federal government doing. Do you get the anger that is out here?
How concerned are you about the front line? You don't believe that there's a racial divide here? Looking back, as president, did you tell the story of race in America enough, do you think? All the places I've been and all the things I've seen, all the people I've talked to, I carry with me. They're a part of what I do right here, holding the powerful accountable, keeping them honest.
AC 360, Tuesday through Saturday only on CNN.
Jake Daniels of the Blackpool Football Club is being celebrated around the world. The 17-year-old came out as gay on Monday in a statement released by the club, the first male footballer to do so in the UK in over 30 years. Daniels' decision has received widespread support from across football and beyond. England captain Harry Kane posted on Twitter, "Massive credit to you and the way your friends, family, club and captain have supported